So this new method of fighting the war on drugs is making some of our allies a little squeamish. As in, a few key partners announced in recent days that they are no longer sharing intelligence with the United States out of fear that they would be complicit in what they view as highly questionable killings. Right now, that list includes the United Kingdom, Canada, Colombia, and maybe France. Meanwhile, the Ford Carrier Strike Group has redeployed and now arrived in the Caribbean, and amidst fears of war with the United States, the Venezuelan defense minister said, quote, "We're ready." Now, a couple days ago, Secretary Hegseth announced the most recent strike, saying, quote, "2 lethal kinetic strikes were conducted on 2 vessels operated by designated terrorist organizations. These vessels were known by our intelligence to be associated with illicit narcotic smuggling, were carrying narcotics, and were transiting along a known narco-trafficking transit route in the Eastern Pacific. Both strikes were conducted in international waters, and 3 male narco-terrorists were aboard each vessel. All 6 were killed. No U.S. forces were harmed." Now, my understanding is this brings the total number of vessels hit to 20, with at least 76 people killed so far. Now, there's a lot of debate, I think good debate, about whether or not this is how we should be carrying out this strategy and the legality of carrying out lethal strikes in this manner. Rand Paul, to me, made the best argument a few weeks back, where he said, if this boat was off the coast of Florida, we would arrest them. But because they're off the coast of Venezuela, we kill them. That one, I've not seen a good argument to kind of square that circle, if you will. But either way, the Associated Press ran an article a couple days ago saying, quote, "Trump has accused boat crews of being narco-terrorists. The truth, AP found, is more nuanced." They said one was a fisherman struggling to eke out a living on $100 a month, another was a career criminal, a third was a former military cadet, and a fourth was a down-on-his-luck bus driver. And I'll link the article in the description below. I saw this, in my opinion, misrepresented to make it seem like everybody that's been killed are just innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. That's not what the AP story says. In fact, everybody that they were able to track down, they kind of linked together that they were trafficking drugs. Across the board, my understanding in that article is that these were not hardened cartel members that have been working with the cartel or risen up through the ranks. They were just people that were, again, down on their luck, needed some extra money, and agreed to traffic these drugs either to the United States or other locations in the Caribbean. So I feel like there's a line to walk there. These are not hardened cartel members, but also if they're agreeing to traffic drugs, they're not innocent civilians. Gets into the challenge in the region, right? Of how do you view somebody that really needs the money to help their family, but in the process takes on an illegal act that does lead to the death of American citizens. Now, that kind of leads into a new article that was just published by The Times talking about how at least the UK, Canada, and maybe even France, and Colombia, are now stopping their intelligence sharing with the United States. They say, quote, "Britain's spy agencies and military have stopped sharing intelligence with the U.S. about suspected drug trafficking vessels in the Caribbean." And I want to stress that. This is not a blanket stop on all intelligence sharing with the United States. That would be wild. It is related specifically to operations in the Caribbean. They say, in an unprecedented move, intelligence gathered from British assets in the region is no longer being passed to the Americans because the UK does not want to be complicit. The Royal Navy carries out operations against suspected smugglers, but a military source said, quote, "We don't just target the vessel and kill people, we would arrest them." According to CNN, the UK grew concerned that the US might use intelligence provided by the British to select targets and paused intelligence sharing more than a month ago. They say intelligence provided by the UK includes the location of drug smuggling vessels and the number of people on board. When the Royal Navy carries out missions itself, it boards the ship, seizes the drugs, detains the crew, and hands them over to the US Coast Guard. And they actually mentioned that the UK is pretty active in their intelligence gathering and recently in counter-narcotics operations in the Caribbean. They're not running the same level of operations as the United States, but there was a picture floating around where they intercepted and boarded a narco sub, like within the last couple of years. So the UK is active there, and right now it sounds like they're going to be going it alone, not sharing that intelligence with the United States. But it's not just the UK. On Tuesday, Colombian President Petro said, quote, "An order has been given at all levels of the public security forces' intelligence services to suspend communication and other dealing with U.S. security agencies." And I feel like there's been this move recently to paint Petro as this, Trump did it, painted Petro as this narco-terrorist trafficking individual. And look, no doubt there's some tension there between the United States and Colombia, but one of the greatest victories we had in the war on drugs, 20 plus years ago, was a very close partnership with Colombia. We've done a lot together. We have assisted their military and their police forces, done a lot of training there to help tamp down the flow of drugs. Now, recently that has spiked, but the complete shutoff of intelligence between the United States and Colombia would be a problem in the broader war on drugs. Canada also can be added to that list. CNN reported, quote, Canada, another key U.S. ally which has helped the U.S. Coast Guard interdict suspected drug traffickers in the Caribbean for nearly 2 decades, has also distanced itself from U.S. military strikes. Sources told CNN that Canada intends to continue its partnership with the Coast Guard, called Operation Caribbean, but the country has made clear to the United States that it does not want its intelligence being used to help target boats for deadly strikes. And just earlier today, we got news that France is probably heading in that same direction, where their Minister of Foreign Affairs, Jean-Noel Barrot, said, quote, we have observed with concern the military operations in the Caribbean because they violate international law and because France has a presence in this region through its overseas territories where more than 1 million of our compatriots reside. I don't know if France is directly sharing intelligence with the United States. If they have so many people located in that region of the world, then they probably are to some degree. Again, France being a very, very close U.S. ally. I would not be shocked to see reporting here in a couple days that France also has cut off intelligence sharing in this region. Now, amidst all of this, the United States continues building up forces in the region, and the Ford Carrier Strike Group just arrived yesterday. But before diving into that, a quick thank you to the sponsor of today's video, American Financing. So the holiday season is finally here, at least in this household, and I'm going to stand by this. Between November 1st and January 2nd, that's the holiday season. I mean, we've got Thanksgiving coming up in a couple weeks, then Christmas, then New Year's, all together, the holidays. But no Christmas decorations until after Thanksgiving. That's a hard line. Bridge too far. Now, we got a lot of things to be grateful for and to look forward to here in the next couple weeks, but it can also be a pretty stressful time of year. I mean, between buying gifts for everyone, traveling or maybe hosting, and then the price of everything is just going up and up, it can be overwhelming. I get it, especially if you're already relying on credit cards to get by. And if that debt is piling up, you are not alone. In fact, if you're a homeowner, you may have considered looking into refinance options in the past, but you didn't because you don't want to lose your low mortgage rate. I get it. That makes sense. And that's why the sponsor of today's show, American Financing, created the Smart Equity Loan, a simple, smart way to get your finances back on track without having to give up your low mortgage rate. Unlike a HELOC, which can fluctuate with the market, the Smart Equity Loan offers a fixed rate, so you'll have one predictable monthly payment. It lets you use your home's equity to pay off high-interest debt, free up your cash flow, and still keep your existing mortgage intact. Also, there are no upfront fees to find out if you qualify. You can just contact them, get the information, see if it's right for you and your family, and make the decision at that point. So if interested in learning more, call American Financing today, 866-886-5350, or visit americanfinancing.net/Preston to learn more. And of course, thank you to American Financing for sponsoring today's video. So the Navy put out a statement yesterday saying, quote, the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group has entered the U.S. Southern Command area of responsibility. They were redeployed from the Middle East just about 2 weeks ago. They say the Maritime Forces' arrival comes after Secretary of War Pete Hegseth directed the Carrier Strike Group to support the president's directive to dismantle transnational criminal organizations and counter narco-terrorism in defense of the homeland. They note that alongside the Ford, they have Carrier Air Wing 8, Destroyer Squadron 2's Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, USS Bainbridge and USS Mahan, and the Integrated Air and Missile Defense Command ship, USS Winston Churchill. There's a lot of firepower. I'm going to put up Ian Ellis's chart here to show the volume of U.S. assets in the region right now. It's a little bit overwhelming, hard to keep up with at this point. But part of the issue here, part of what's kind of raising a concern is you look at this chart and you say, that's for drugs? That's where it seems like a lot. In fact, CNN reported that in a briefing last month, two senior U.S. Special Operations officers could not explain why the administration needed so many powerful military assets stationed in the Caribbean just to blow up small boats. This is in a closed-door session on Capitol Hill. That, of course, leads us to the idea of a broader war with Venezuela, which seems like it's probably been in the cards for at least a couple months now. Speaking to that, Time reported that the Venezuelan Defense Minister, Pedro Lopez, on Tuesday announced a plan to place the country's military on full operational readiness, calling for the deployment of all land, air, and sea and missile assets, as well as the country's militia. Quote, "The aggression will be responded to with national unity. We are ready. Here, we don't want war." They say the deployment advances Maduro's Independence Plan 200, a military order enacted in response to the U.S.'s increased presence in the Caribbean. Pedrino said the deployment is to, quote, "confront imperial threats." They note that last month, Venezuelan officials announced that they had started training civilians for military operations, and they estimate that the country has 340,000 members of the armed forces, compared with 1.3 active duty U.S. personnel. I don't know that the active duty personnel of the U.S. military to Venezuela is necessarily the most important factor here. They make a point. Venezuela is not ready to go toe-to-toe with the U.S. military. That's not the case now. It has not ever really been the case, to my knowledge. So it's not a matter of who has more forces. In fact, Venezuela gets this as well. And I wouldn't look at any of these statements of we're preparing the military, we're getting everybody ready, as an indication that something is getting ready to come, because in all likelihood, the first thing that would happen would be some sort of standoff strike munitions. It would not be Blackhawks or Chinooks landing outside of Caracas or the 82nd Airborne jumping in to secure an airfield. It would be Tomahawk strikes or bombs being launched or bombs being dropped from bombers overhead. And the mobilization of a couple hundred people on the ground isn't really going to be a major indicator that that's coming. Now, Maduro has put out notes in recent days suggesting that they are planning to shift to more of a guerrilla war, which should not be a shock to anybody. This is according to Reuters. They say Maduro's government is betting on a so-called prolonged resistance campaign and an anarchization plan that would rely on small military units, militias, and intelligence forces to wage sabotage and street unrest if the United States were to invade. The strategy would use intelligence services and armed supporters to create disorder in Caracas and make the nation ungovernable. The two strategies are complementary, and it's unclear when they would be deployed. Reuters reported that its sources said the strategies did face long odds of success, as the nation is not prepared for a conflict against the United States. It should come as no shock to anybody that Maduro or anyone close to him in power does not want to wage a direct military confrontation with the United States, and they would look at more of an unconventional type fight. It's nasty terrain around Venezuela, and there's a lot of competing factions, right? There is cartel activity and some rebel groups operating outside of kind of city centers. It's not clear what that would look like. Messy is probably the best way to put it. Now, in terms of not being able to stand toe-to-toe with the U.S. military, there were some indications recently that they might be looking at some of their allies. Maduro might be looking at China, Iran, Russia, maybe, to help backstop them. It doesn't really look like that's playing out at all. Russia's kind of the key one here. Iran doesn't really have the means to provide any sort of significant military assistance to Venezuela right now. In terms of unconventional capabilities, Hezbollah influence, things like that, sure. But large military equipment, that's not Iran. China, generally speaking, has kind of stayed out of this. They're going to probably focus more on the diplomatic and economic side. Russia is the key one there. But Sergei Lavrov earlier today denied the statements of the first deputy chairman of the State Duma Defense Committee about the alleged deliveries of air defense systems to Venezuela amid the current crisis, stating that Russia has made it clear it does not plan to provide military assistance to Venezuela. Lavrov emphasized that although Venezuela remains a friendly country and a strategic partner, these relations do not imply mutual defense obligations. He stressed that the cooperation between the two countries is not an alliance that obliges Russia to defend Venezuela militarily. Pretty important in a lot of ways, right? I don't think anybody really expected that an attack on Venezuela would prompt a Russian response directly against the United States. To be blunt, Russia does not have the capabilities to project power right now like they once did. A great example of that was watching the fall of Assad in Syria. Russia did arguably nothing other than evacuate Assad and his family to go play video games in Moscow. In fact, when the Russian Air Force tried to push back, at that time, Jelani, now Shara, moving down towards Damascus, they were infamously bombing locations days after those forces had pushed through, and just like striking random city centers, not really playing any role in helping to prop up their ally in Syria. So the idea that they would be able to come all the way across the Atlantic and somehow assist Venezuela, not very realistic. Now, one story that's been floated a little bit is that it's not Russia, it's going to be the Wagner Group. And let's just cut to the chase here. The Wagner Group is not that significant of an adversary, especially against the United States. All right, they have proven a valuable commodity in certain African nations, at times in the Middle East, but the idea that Wagner would put together a force in Venezuela that would be any sort of detriment to the U.S. is just fan fiction. In fact, Jack Margolin, who has done a lot of work studying the Wagner Group over the years, put together a thread recently saying, quote, "Lots of spurious stories of Wagner being sent to Venezuela. That's not true in any meaningful way. The closest we might get are GRU military advisors being sent to Venezuela as they have before, but more than likely it's token hardware. There are likely some high-speed GRU types running around in Caracas right now. Is there some level of private armed presence? Yes, probably similar with Russian companies concerned about their losses like they were in 2019. But there isn't some clandestine force being deployed by Russia that meaningfully changes U.S. calculus. That would take something on par with when Wagner plopped an SA-22 in Mali, or they started flying MiGs and Sus in Libya. In both those cases, the hardware and equipment was directly provisioned by the Russian MOD, and Wagner's claim to direct control of these assets was always a bit of an obvious fib. I don't expect the Russians to do anything like that here. Seizing the initiative from the U.S. in Europe and Africa was much cheaper. Here, there's a lot of risk and very little reward given the world historic logistical feat required for them to even wobble the scales in the Caribbean. Again, even if Russia was not a little bit preoccupied, to say the least, in Ukraine, the mobilization to get Russian forces in any size or quantity or even notable equipment to Venezuela is significant. Can they get a surface-to-air system or two there? Can they get a couple aircraft or helicopters? Sure. But one or two, surface-to-air missile systems is not changing the fight when the United States decides it's time to go after Maduro, which, again, seems like any day now we could wake up and find out that the bombing campaign over Caracas has begun. So we'll do our best to keep an eye on it. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.